So, to get started, we'll do a fairly easy question first. How did you come into this work?
Well, first I can say is I'm a latecomer. You know, there are people that I know are in this room and a lot of people working on the issue of homelessness that have found their passion in their 20s and have spent their whole life working on it. And myself, I'm an architect, and I didn't really wake up to this issue until 5 years ago when I started a Facebook site called Homeless in Seattle. And how that actually happened was I moved my office to the Fremont neighborhood and just started taking coffee breaks in the morning down by the canal on the bench. And it was there that I started to meet a lot of people that were homeless. And when I did that, two things started to enter into my head. One was that the people that I was meeting were fundamentally different than the negative stereotype I had grown up with about the homeless. And so within me, a conversation started to take place that something's not quite right. The second thing that had an impact on me was I would be on this bench talking with folks who had nothing to their name, nothing at all, but what they carried on their back in a backpack. And maybe an hour later, I would be in my architecture office. At that time, I was working on a house that was over $4 million, you know, for two people. And nothing against those folks. They're beautiful, wonderful, kind people. But the dichotomy of those two worlds, of people that had absolutely nothing, and then that afternoon I would be designing a front door that would be costing $50,000, right? That just trying to rectify those two worlds in my head. So with those two thoughts and meeting more and more people, I did have one event where I met somebody by the name of Chiaka, who I started a Facebook page for to sell his art. And that friendship really opened up my eyes to the issue. And out of that, I decided to start this Facebook page called Homeless in Seattle. And really, if I had not gotten the community response back, I would have stopped. You know, so really, how did I get into this has a lot to do with the community response. So,
for me, you know, when I was in college, I was pretty passion driven. I was this ADD guy who was best at the things that I was intensely interested in. I went to UMass Amherst from like 83 to 87 and really threw myself into student activism there. And we were active on a whole number of issues. There was a group called the Radical Student Union that was very multi-issue. But one of the things that we did was we drove from Amherst, Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. to support FAST that Mitch Snyder, who at that time was a very prominent national level activist on homelessness, and homelessness was exploding over the 80s. And we participated in a mass civil disobedience in DC and spent like 3 days in DC Central Cell Block. So I suppose that was my first engagement with the issue, but what really drew me in was after I graduated and moved to Boston in '87, and there was a homeless protest encampment that started at the State House and moved across the street to the Boston Common, and then spent nearly 3 months in front of City Hall. And I spent a lot of time there and kind of became their unofficial, unpaid organizer that helped with camp dynamics. And what really drew me in and kept me there was the people were just so real, you know, all of the kind of bullshit stuff that preoccupies us gets real simple when people are living in survival mode on the street. And just, you know, that piece of it, people being, you know, at the same time very heroic and very flawed and just living very close to the bone was something that I wanted to be a part of.
Did you ever feel like you were not qualified to be working with people experiencing homelessness?
I'm still totally faking it.
Every day. I think one of the things that helps me is that what we're doing at Facing Homelessness is we're not actually, we're purposely not trying to fix anyone. We're really just trying to put love into the equation, so it comes from a natural human place. So if we stay on track with that, I feel qualified. But when we start to case manage, or we do a number of other things that are way out beyond my architectural training, yeah, and that happens every day. I mean, I know Margie and Sarah and we talk about these things, about how to stay on track. So
yeah, there's a lot of just making it up as you go along involved. Particularly when I got started in doing this work, I was trying to figure out how to do empowerment organizing with homeless people, and the sort of standard community organizing models didn't really translate very well. So we were figuring it out, and that continues to be the case. Stuff comes up all the time that we do, and there isn't a roadmap. You just make it up as you go along.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of making it up, what do you think of the City of Seattle's current involvement in finding solutions to homelessness?
Tim, do you want to start?
They're trying. He said charitably. No, really, I mean, Seattle...
They're trying.
Seattle, the litany goes, spends a larger percent of their annual budget on homelessness and housing than nearly any other city in the United States. They, like everybody, are sort of married to the federal model for ending homelessness, which revolves around subpopulations and housing first and various approaches that are more or less imposed top down. And if you want to get federal funding, you've got to go there, and it shapes the whole approach. And bottom line, 10-year plan is about to come to a conclusion. 10-year plan to end homelessness is about to come to a conclusion. And we have more homeless people, more unsheltered people in Seattle than we ever had before. That's not necessarily the fault of the city of Seattle. I mean, you have federal trends in development and housing and the remaking of cities. It gets complicated, but a lot of federal divestment over the last 3 decades, a lot of state level divestment with austerity, and it rolls downhill and manifests on our streets. And to Seattle's credit, they've tried to backfill a lot of those cuts that have come from the feds, from the state level, even the county level. And they have been open to experimentation with models that to a lot of cities would be really scary, like opening up public property to 10 cities. So credit has to be given where it's due, but I think that ultimately the depoliticized social worky framework that we have for dealing with homelessness is a setup for failure, because it ignores the core political questions that are behind the growth of homelessness.
And what I would add to this discussion about top-down is that I think we need to flip it, right, and say that really it needs to be bottom-up. I think if we talk about how's Seattle doing, we should really be talking about how are we doing? How is the Seattle community, how's everybody that's living in a home doing about this issue? Because if everybody that's living in a home in this city wouldn't stand for it, right, the politics would change overnight. We would vote different people in, we would view the issue in a way that would not allow this just to continue to go on. So.
I'm going to point out that none of you have any questions, which I find hard to believe because all of you are here. So feel free to think of a question so it's not just me talking to them. Okay, what do you think about the University of Washington's current involvement in finding a solution to homelessness? Or what do you know of it?
I think you're going to have to summarize that for us.
Okay. Well, this is a great moment for
Way to throw it back. That was a very adept dodging there of that. I'll be honest, I don't actually know. I don't, you know, and I think we're in the U District and recently, and it's something that we would love to have a stronger relationship with UW. Actually, with all of the universities and high schools, quite frankly, because we see that as this incredible opportunity to expose people to the fact that the negative stereotype is absolutely false. And young people are in this beautiful place to be heard about it and make a difference. So I think, you know, the UW, certainly by, if they can take on a tent city, that's a beautiful start. You know.
Oh, we have a question.
And leading right into that, because it is, I know that there are students and faculty out here at the University of Washington who have, for years now, been trying to get the university to invite a tent city out. And that would be one great way for the university. Every time that there's a tent city at Seattle Pacific University, Seattle University, the students have all benefited greatly from interacting with people. And that is the real key to solving this problem in the community, is having people-to-people conversations and relationships. Tying to that, there are other cities in the Pacific Northwest that have not evolved yet on the question of encampments. In fact, I just came from a discussion with some cities that are absolutely convinced that laws against public camping are crucial to the safety of both housed and homeless people, and that if, you know, and elected officials who are just scared to death that if they say anything otherwise, the entire business district is going to chew their ass. So, how do, you know, any suggestions on what to do about that?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge is to lead by example and to engage people broadly in the university community, not just in hosting the tent city, but in the campaign towards hosting the tent city. Because, I mean, there's been pushes for this before that have failed. So one of the questions you have to ask is, what are you going to do differently this time that is going to make the difference? I think it's extraordinarily powerful, both as a statement to the broader community and within the university community when you host a tent city. It's one of the more immediate opportunities to engage that I can imagine. And what I love about tent cities is that you, and hosting tent cities, is that you are supporting people who are organizing in their own survival interest to meet their needs in the face of overwhelming system failure. And that's powerful. Not only that you're providing that direct assistance that people need and the solidarity and support, but in the act of it, you're pointing out the larger system failure that necessitates a tent city. And, you know, I think if I were doing a campaign to do this, I would think about all of the ways that I could involve people across campus to engage in low barrier ways and become part of the campaign. You know, maybe it's a clothing drive, maybe it's a shoe drive, maybe it's a winter survival gear drive, that allows you to interact with a lot of students, do something meaningful, and build a base of support in the process.
I would agree. I think clearly it's a marketing problem, right? Because every single community that accepts a tent city walks away better for it and have a clearer understanding what's going on. When I first started the Homelessness Seattle site, maybe 3 or 4 months into it, I said to my wife, you know, I think I'm going to go live the month of February in Tent City 3 when they were at SPU. And I can tell you that it changed my life. I mean, there were so many insights, such as homelessness is a full-time job, right? I mean, it's crazy, you know, to put that on people by saying, you know, you got all this free time, you're not working, fix it, right? It's the furthest from the truth. People are trying to survive, and it's a full-time job doing it. The community that evolves in a tent city is remarkable. Not everybody gets along, not everybody sees eye to eye, but these 100 or so people function as a family, as a community, and that's also powerful. And I think if those type of things get marketed and told, who's going to say no to that, right? I think it's a beautiful thing.
So, and this question's more for Rex, but Tim, I'd love to get your perception too. Did you have any preconceived notions about homelessness or people experiencing homelessness that you found challenged through your work?
That preconceived notions that now challenge me, or before I started it?
Before you started.
You know, well, I think we wake up, every one of us, feeling we're compassionate people. Nobody wakes up and thinks, you know, I'm the jerk, right? And I think all of us go out into the world, and so my own feelings about homelessness, I kept this negative stereotype, I think, in my background in my head. I didn't walk around having these negative feelings to people that were suffering on the street. But I think the challenge really is to break through that, you know, that barrier that you have somewhere in your subconscious about homelessness. The beautiful thing really is that once you pierce it, just pierce it, it pops completely. It's not, I mean, really, I've said this before, that the thing about architecture is that you spend all your time looking and searching how to create beauty, and that's an uphill battle the whole way. The thing with this is the beauty's already there. The beauty is in each person, and all we have to do is just open ourselves to it. And the minute you do that, it changes everything. So,
yeah, I think, to be honest, it's a kind of a constant challenge for all of us to keep our heads on straight around this stuff. I mean, we're surrounded by demeaning cultural stereotypes of who homeless folks are, various, you know, outgroups like you know, drug addicts and mentally ill people, things like that. You know, we carry around baggage. We're surrounded by it, and you know, I still find myself surprised by my thinking sometimes. I think, you know, not to denigrate social work. Social work is normal, or is noble, but you know, I think the whole field of social work, you know, often presupposes this very unequal relationship where, you know, we're about diagnosing people and figuring out what the hell's wrong with them and what we need to tell them about how they're going to fix themselves, and you know, there's a power imbalance going on there, and a lot of arrogance, and you know, I think that transcends social work. Everybody seems to feel well equipped to judge homeless people and tell them what is the best thing for themselves. And you know, I'm not innocent of that myself. I think that we all have to constantly be vigilant. It's like, you know, any form of implied bias, it's there, you know. I mean, saying that I don't have any negative stereotypes around homelessness is, a lot like me saying that I'm not a racist. It's just bullshit. We all are.
I would agree. I think it's our biggest challenge actually in getting community involved is to get involved in a healthy way. I mean, there's so many people that do come and want to help, and then it becomes this power imbalance, which is difficult.
The audience. Yes.
I was just wondering, over the years, how have you seen the city change kind of in its attitude and interaction with homeless?
It's funny, I was just actually writing about this last night, because tomorrow in Tacoma, I'm part of a panel on neutralizing homelessness. This sort of talks about the federal framework and how it functions as ideology and what's happened in Seattle. And, the 10-year plan to end homelessness changed a lot about the city's approach to homelessness and focused it quite narrowly. And the focus went from meeting people's emergency survival needs to this purportedly more proactive approach that centered on housing first, identifying key populations that were prioritized and moving them into housing. And the theory was that it would shrink the need for emergency shelter. It seems like a reasonable theory that if you move the sort of more vulnerable, more difficult to serve homeless folks and more expensive homeless folks into housing, shelter system spends less of their time dealing with more difficult to serve individuals. They're able to focus more on other folks, and gradually over time you reduce the population in the shelter, and you end homelessness by getting people into housing. And that hasn't worked. What was most striking to me was in 2005, and the first year of the 10-year plan, the Director of Human Services, Patricia McIntyre, they tried to cut funding for emergency shelter that first year. They tried to eliminate 100 shelter beds based on the promise of housing first and the 10-year plan to end homelessness. They thought they would get a head start on that.
By going backwards.
And Patricia McIntyre and at that time, spending on emergency shelter was about 70% of city funding on housing and homelessness. And Patricia McIntyre was quoted in the Seattle Times saying that she imagined that in 10 years that amount of funding would be down to 10 to 15% for emergency shelter.
Wow. And
the city just released their report on, I forget the name of it, it was basically about the efficiency of their approach to housing and homelessness. And they're still spending about 70% of their budget on housing and homelessness on emergency shelter. And the mayor's recommendation is that we raid the emergency shelter funding and put it into permanent housing, because obviously that trick has worked in the past. I guess what I would say is the city has continued to do more or less the same thing with more of a focus on getting people into housing, but have not confronted the basic fact of what's driving homelessness. There's a study that appeared in, I think, the Journal of Urban Affairs in 2012 that I've recently been quoting a lot, that documents that in urban areas, for every $100 median increase in the median cost of rent, you get about a 15% increase in homelessness.
Wow.
And for rural areas, for non-metropolitan areas, that goes up to something, I think it's 37%, 39%, something crazy like that. What that would tell me is if you want to have an effective program to reduce and ultimately end homelessness, do something to put controls on the rising costs of rent and housing. I mean, duh. But for some reason, they haven't gone there.
Great.
So there's a lot going on in Seattle now as far as planning the city, and we've kind of been in a boom for a little while and building lots of stuff, and Amazon moving into South Lake Union and building up that area, Capitol Hill getting really gentrified, light rail moving in and all the developments and whatnot. And there's been a lot of talk by urbanists, like intentionally thinking about how to shape the city and make that an intentional thing rather than just kind of have stuff appear where it is. I'm wondering, other than or in addition to just kind of the question of affordable housing, where do you folks and where does advocacy for homeless play into that sort of planning of the future development of the city?
Well, that's a big question. It enters in for me a little bit too on how we want to address homelessness with regards to housing. And one of the issues that we talked about, for instance, 10 cities and all the things that are wonderful. One of the things that I have a problem with is the segregation, right? We're still taking people that are homeless and putting them in a camp. And everybody that's homed is looking in the camp, right? So same with, the beautiful buildings that DESC and Lehigh and other people are building. They're wonderful, they're important, but I still think the long-range thought is integration. Like, how do we get people to actually live next to us that are of various incomes and as much diversity as possible? We all know that's healthier for us. I'm going to take 2 minutes and tell one thought that I hope to see happen, and that is to take advantage of the backyard cottage zoning that we allow in Seattle called Dadoos, and that allows an 800 square foot house to be put into the backyard of every residential lot in the city. If those were transitional houses, right, for people that were moving from poverty and up out of homelessness, there's an opportunity there where land is available and where integration is available. And I think, whether it's that idea or it's the next 15 that coming down the road, I think we do need to think about integration and not just isolation that a lot of the answers are now for zoning.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I haven't heard anybody offer a solution to, hyper development in Seattle and what that means for housing affordability and homelessness. That to me rings true to the scale of the problem. I mean, there's lots of things that can be part of the solution. Linkage fees for developers to create funds for creating more low-income housing, relaxing zoning codes to, and doing things like the Dadoos and that's sort of, small development that creates inexpensive housing. But I think, the basic problem is that we lack a vision for creating extremely affordable housing in an environment in Seattle on a mass scale. And we need to figure out how to hit that intersection of housing affordability for very poor people that provides maximum freedom and privacy for the people who live in the housing at minimum cost so that it's affordable. I don't think that nonprofits and government can do it on their own, that there needs to also be some kind of a market solution that creates a new form of housing. A lot needs to change in this country before we're not dealing with the dynamics of, extremely rich and extremely poor. But that's the trajectory we're on. I mean, I see inequality continuing to deepen for quite some time. I'm not seeing any kind of a turning point on the horizon where I wouldn't expect that to continue to be the trend. And I think as long as we have that, our problem is there's a hell of a lot of people out there who can't afford basic housing. And the people who can afford better housing are sort of poaching further on down in the food chain, I mean, those rentals that are relatively cheap are often snapped up by people who can afford more, because there's just a profound affordability shortage. So, it's complicated, and I can't say I'm particularly hopeful at the moment.
I think it is complicated, but I also think, like, if every person in this room left thinking that they were going to get involved, and then they infected other people to get involved, I really believe that the answer lies in this room and all the other people that are attending discussions on homelessness. And when I had my Fremont office, we've moved to the U District now, but when I had the Fremont office, and suddenly my office turned into a drop-in center, right? There were 10 to 12 people that were homeless in my office all day long. It's the reason I had to quit architecture, quite honestly. I got a lot of negative feedback from a number of the neighbors that I had somehow invented homelessness or something, right? And this is the problem that needs to change. The NIMBYism, the attitude, all of it. We can kind of point to city and other structural systems for why they're failing or what's going wrong, but ultimately, what has to change with regards to homelessness is not the homeless, it's us. We have to change. We have to embrace this full head-on, jump completely in. And when we do that, we really do it, not just talk about it, then it changes. And it's within our power to do that.
There was an article last week in the Seattle Weekly about the criminalization of homelessness. And it looked at several cities across the state, laws that are being passed. It basically makes it illegal to be poor and unhoused. What are your thoughts on advocacy efforts that we could participate in to undo that sort of thinking?
We have, Seattle is a bit of a weird outlier in that area. I mean, there's things that are criminalized, that they've got the no-sit, lie ordinance, and things like that, but they're not really pushing on enforcement of that. The city attorney and the county prosecutor are pretty adamant that they're not interested in prosecuting stupid poverty crime. The police aren't writing that many tickets around it. But, at the same time, there's this ongoing conflict over public space, because public space is being colonized by corporations. And Seattle is becoming a richer and richer city, and Seattle is at the same time a major hub for human services. We've got the tax base to support that. And if people become homeless outside of Seattle, often they don't have the services, in King County anyway, often they wind up coming to Seattle because, it's the hub for services and it's where they gotta go if they're gonna get any help. And those things are in contradiction, and that's where these kinds of laws come from, even though we're in a relatively enlightened period at the moment. I mean, right now, I don't know where people in this room are on the park smoking ban thing, because, a lot of people don't get it. They really buy the city's rhetoric that this is about public health and preventing children from eating cigarette butts. But this is about, it's going to be enforced in downtown parks. This year the number of unsheltered homeless went up in Seattle by 22%. There's a lot of people downtown with nowhere to go. And 73% that's the statistic I keep hearing, 73% of homeless people smoke for a variety of reasons that, I won't go into here. So, you know, if you want a tool to shove homeless people out of downtown parks and ban them, this is it. And we, you know, the comment period for that has passed, Real Changes, and some other folks have been fighting pretty hard around it and come out against it. The ACLU has come out against it. The Seattle Human Rights Commission has come out against it. But, you know, this is the sort of thing that when we see it happening and there's a public debate around it, we need to engage and understand what's going on.
You know, even the discussion about criminalization of homelessness should be a reality check, right? I mean, it's just ludicrous. It's crazy that we would even begin to do that. So to me, when I hear that, and I hear laws being passed, I feel like, you know, there must be aliens or something. I mean, it's hard to even imagine, quite honestly. And it means to normalize even the conversation seems absurd. It's so far out of whack. So again, I would say that's where, you know, each of us need to stand up and have our voice heard about this, to say this is a ridiculous conversation about not allowing people that have no place to live or go, that we're going to penalize them for it while they're down. It's crazy.
I recently met with a young man from the University of Washington, Bothell, who is focused on creating a group to support homeless college students here at the UW. I was sort of shocked to find out that he told me the first survey they did, they found there were 1,500 homeless students here at the UW campus.
Wow.
Right now, sitting in class. What can we do as a community to recognize and support our fellow Huskies? And how do we do it respectfully?
You know, I would say it's the same answer that we would treat anybody that's suffering through homelessness. We need to treat each other with respect and non-judgment. Meet people where they are right then and there. Don't bring, you know, your preconceived ideas about what homelessness is. Just see that person for they are in that moment, you know, their own beauty.
I would have the university do a dormitory room free of charge.
What do you say?
This fine gentleman in the back just suggested free housing from the UW. There's a petition I'd like to sign.
I don't really have anything to add to what Rex said.
Did you have a question?
So the city of Seattle has done a lot to control the movement of homeless people in some way. The downtown development project, the elimination of free bus rides, and the like. What do you think can be done to combat that, and how could it be turned around, like the segregation of homeless people into condensed areas where crime becomes more rampant? If that's not what should be done.
Wow, that's a great question. And his question is that there have been various policies that have been put in place that tend to increase the isolation and segregation of homeless people, like the removal of the ride-free zone and the buses and things like that, and what can be done to try to counteract that sort of thing. I don't know. Do you have any ideas, Rex?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think it comes back to educating ourselves about these issues. You know, just asking that question is part of it. This is a tangent, but it's connected, and that is that, you know, people often say, well, how can I get involved, right? And everybody's on a spectrum of what they're comfortable with, but everybody does have the ability to play a part. Now, if you're uncomfortable, for instance, for whatever reason, of maybe engaging with somebody that's homeless, maybe your part is at a dinner party bringing these questions up, right? You are infecting people at that dinner table with the thought. Right? And I think you can be that person to even bring the conversation up or just ask that question. You know, I think we just need to start talking about it, and if enough people are talking about it, then government and policies and politicians and all of that follow suit. We need to know we have the control of that.
Yeah, I think the other piece is that there's a lot of organizations that are doing amazing work. The longer I do this work, the more aware I am of the really just frankly mind-blowingly amazing network of activists that there are in Seattle, and more broadly, that are just doing dynamite work and are really committed and fighting. You know, the Transit Riders Union took the lead on the bus issue, and they did a phenomenal job on their organizing around that, and they were eventually able to get a compromise passed around a low-income fare that wasn't the win that we were looking for, but it was significant. It made a difference to folks. You know, the work that Share Wheel is doing around the tent cities, all of the tent cities, I mean, this is, again, it's about breaking down that segregation, you know, getting out into different communities, becoming part of those communities, and changing people's perceptions.
The work Real Change is doing. I mean, really, honestly, those type of engagements where people actually have the ability to interact, like customers do with Real Change vendors. Honestly, I think those are small victories won every day.
So we're going to take, it looks like 2 more questions from the audience. Did you have another one? But while I have your attention, these lovely cards will be handed out by volunteers at the end of this fine presentation. Please feel free or obligated to complete them. Thank you so much.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. My question is just like, how do you upset the power imbalance that health professionals have in terms of dealing with the homeless population, and just like as students or as people with homes, we kind of have a power to that, and then also. What about the services that we marginalize people, like that further marginalize people, like people who are struggling with substance abuse or are not gender conforming, and how are like the home services helping those people? Thanks.
You know, I'd begin by saying that a little bit of respect goes a long ways. People go through their days having a feeling of being treated like crap. Not just having a feeling, but actually being treated like crap, you know, and you know, people talking down to them continuously and infantilizing them, and you know, treating them as less than, and that wears on people, and people start to, you know, internalize that oppression and to think of themselves as less than deserving, and that leads to a real feeling of hopelessness. So I think, you know, engaging with respect and looking past the condition to the person, you know, it's kind of hard to describe, but I know that Rex does this. This is Rex's sort of unique talent that he's able to get across in photos and the way that he writes about people. You know, there's this sort of a Quaker maxim that I've always really liked, and that is to see that of God in everyone. And I think that that's, you know, the fundamental challenge that we have is to just see the person.
And all of these questions are searching, that we're hearing and that we always hear, are searching for answers, right? We're always looking to where can we find the answers? How can we make this better? And I would bring it back. If everyone in this room left here today and just spent the rest of their life acknowledging people that were homeless, just saying hello, giving a smile, that would be the beginning of a profound change. Just this group right here. So, I mean, it's easy to talk about larger programs and keep looking to what the city's doing or what, you know, some larger structural systemic issue might be, but really it's just down to each one of you here right now today, you know, agreeing with yourself that you're going to get involved on a personal level.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to speak to the particular answer that you brought up, you know, whether we're talking about healthcare social work, human services, delivery, law enforcement. There is this kind of an institutionalized professional arrogance that is involved, and we can make a choice on whether we're going to participate in that or not.
I was wondering what your opinion was of the SPD's efforts with the LEAD program in the downtown corridor.
I'm really familiar with that because I've been participating in the Center City Initiative, which is this, meeting that we have every 2 weeks. We've been meeting for a couple of years, and it's led up to the expansion of the LEAD program. Every other Friday I find myself in a room with the leadership of the Downtown Seattle Association and law enforcement and human service providers and legal people and outreach workers, and we hammer out what this is going to look like, and the city tells us what they're heading toward, and we suspend judgment and try to believe them. And I think that the approach that LEAD is taking, just to describe for you for the people who don't know, LEAD is Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, and it offers the police another tool in regard to low-level vice crime, particularly low-level drug dealing and prostitution, where instead of just simply arresting somebody, they can do a social services intervention, and there's a pool of resources, housing, treatment, various other things that they can kind of jump to. There's resources that are available to people in that program that kind of jump them ahead of the queue and become available. And it is a pioneering national model for not just being locked in the cycle of arresting people and then putting them back out on the street and nothing has changed in their lives, and as soon as you arrest them, somebody else steps in to take their place, and it doesn't make it has no real impact. And what's exciting about this program is that it's working. The recidivism rates for people who go through the program are dramatically lower. There's a number of really impressive success stories. And it's been embraced by the city and the county sheriff's office, Seattle police, prosecutors' offices, parole officers. Everybody is kind of on the program with this, and there's a lot of moving parts, and it's complicated, and it's not perfect, but it's moving in the right direction. And other cities are looking at it as a model for how to do something that actually helps people and doesn't just deepen the cycle. So I'm a big fan, and I'm willing to overlook a lot of failures in the interest of the sort of larger picture of long-term success and where this looks like it's going.
Thank you, gentlemen. So before I ask my last question, I want to thank our sponsors again. That's the UW School of Social Work, the Community and Environmental Planning Department, University District Street Medicine, and the Health Equity Circle. I'd also like to invite the representatives from the University District Street Medicine and Tent City 3, the Tent City Collective, to the front. But before we go, I was just wondering, do you think we're ever going to end homelessness?
We're not going to end homeless anymore. We're going to make periods of homelessness infrequent, brief, and one time, I think is the new rhetoric. No, that's bullshit. A lot is going to have to change. My standard answer to this is that we can end homelessness because we've ended it before. You know, there was a previous period of mass homelessness in the United States that went from the post-Civil War period, kind of coincided with Civil War demobilization and the imposition of the factory labor system. It turned social relations upside down. You had a huge wandering, itinerant labor class. You know, it's where we get our present stereotypes around hobos and that sort of thing. And there were, you know, huge shanty towns in, you know, pretty much every major city in the United States, Seattle included. And the labor demands of World War II, emptied out those shanty towns and you know, created full employment. But when the war demobilization happened, you know, people could have gone back to those shanty towns. We could have gone back to mass homelessness, and we did not. Instead, we put a whole bunch of policies in place to build and strengthen a broad middle class and create shared prosperity. And that model lasted through the 70s, you know, and then, you know, another huge shift in the world economy created a new kind of dispossessed class and a new round of radical inequality. And I think, you know, the solutions are more complicated, but they are similar. You know, the way to end homelessness is to build broad prosperity for everybody.
I think the question of will we end homelessness, you have to ask first another question, and that is, do we want to end homelessness? And I think if we want to and really answer that from our hearts, then we will end homelessness. But we have to want to do it first. And I think that's the battle.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Let's give them a round of applause.